Intermittent fasting. A Google search of the term provides over 58 million results. But the actual evidence-based research that pops up compared to the headline-chasing blogs, videos, and articles, well, it's humorously one-sided. It's a term you've obviously heard, maybe a term you've used, but beyond such headlines and fad-chasing, what does the term really mean? And what does the evidence tell us about the how, the what, and the why? Welcome to the latest episode of the Catalyst Health, Wellness, and Performance Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Bradford Cooper, and today's guest is one of the world's foremost experts on the subject of intermittent fasting, Dr. Mark Mattson of Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. Dr. Mattson is a professor of neuroscience at Johns Hopkins and the chief of the Laboratory of Neurosciences at the National Institute on Aging. His work has looked into how that brain and the body respond and adapt to fasting and exercise. If there is an expert, a premier expert on the subject of intermittent fasting, Dr. Mattson is that expert. In fact, he is among the most highly cited neuroscientists in the world. To say we felt fortunate that he agreed to join us on this episode would be a clear understatement. Depending on when you're listening to this, there may still be a chance to join us for the October MBHWC approved health and wellness coaching certification, which is our last one for 2021 and the last chance to get registered before the rates finally go up heading into 2022. Whether you're wanting to pursue this now or considering it for the future, we're happy to talk it through with you. Just drop us an email, results@catalystcoachinginstitute.com, and we'll set up some time to talk it through. You can also access a multitude of resources on the website at catalystcoachinginstitute.com anytime you'd like. Now, on to our discussion with world-renowned researcher Dr. Mark Mattson on the latest episode of the Catalyst Health, Wellness, and Performance Coaching Podcast. Dr. Mattson, thank you so much for joining us today. This is an intriguing concept, a lot of information come out of the gate. Just thank you. Appreciate you being here.
Okay, I'm glad to talk to you today. I look forward to the conversation.
Let's just get started with the basics. Can you describe intermittent fasting in practical terms for our listeners, and then some of the general ways in which it benefits individuals outside of simply calorie reduction?
Intermittent fasting, first and foremost, is not a diet. It's an eating pattern in which there's sufficiently long periods of time of no energy intake to deplete energy stores in the liver, which is glucose, and to mobilize fats, which are then converted to ketones, which during long periods of fasting can keep cells' energy levels up when glucose levels are being maintained low.
And essentially, there's three types of understand. There's the alternate day fasting. There's the 5-2, which is 5 days of generally normal eating, and then 2 days interspersed with a 0 or maybe in that 500 to 1,000 calorie. And then there's a time restricted, which seems to be the more popular, probably because it fits with life a little bit more, where you're fasting for 14 to 18 hours and then eating in between those. Is the research showing similar results? First of all, did I get that right? And then is the research showing similar results across all three of those? Or is there a hierarchy of value and benefit and those kind of things?
Yes, you got it right. And we don't know. We know from human studies in overweight humans, any of those intermittent fasting eating patterns will enable them to lose weight, and specifically abdominal fat, and to improve their glucose regulation and risk factors for a number of chronic diseases. Whether it's daily time-restricted eating or 2 days a week eating only 500 calories, 5-2 approach, or even more harsh, I guess, alternate day eating only 500 calories. They haven't been compared head-to-head in the same study, so we can't really comment. But we can say that compared to eating 3 meals a day plus snacks, any of these intermittent fasting eating patterns seem to be better than that.
Interesting. Let's talk about the trends. Why do you think intermittent fasting has garnered so much attention recently? It seems like the last year or two, even though it's been around for decades, it's really come to the forefront. Was there some specific tipping point that you saw being engrossed in this?
Yes. So work in my lab in beginning in the 1990s, performed many studies in rats and mice where we found that intermittent fasting had an anti-aging effect and protected the brain against dysfunction and degeneration and mild of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. And we investigated the mechanisms and came to the working conclusion that the intermittent fasting imposes a mild but beneficial stress on cells, and they respond by being more robust and resilient. And then we started collaborating with various scientists and clinicians who were working with humans who saw our animal work. And one of those was Dr. Michelle Harvey in England. So we did 2 studies with her. It was mainly her. We just analyzed a lot of blood samples for her. And both studies had approximately 100 women. They were overweight, and they were randomly assigned to either 2 days a week eating only 500 to 600 calories. The other 5 days, they were advised to just eat normally, don't purposely change their eating habits. And then the other group of women, we had them eat 3 meals a day, breakfast, lunch, dinner, spaced out. About each meal had 20 to 25% fewer calories than they had been taking in.
Okay.
And so we followed them for 6 months. Both groups of women lost weight, but the women on what's now called 5-2 intermittent fasting, so that approach is based on these 2 studies I'm talking about. Those women on that intermittent fasting regimen lost more belly fat. They had greater improvement in insulin sensitivity and some other markers in blood health indicators. And then what happened that led to the popularization or the recognition by the general public is that a producer for the BBC named Michael Mosley, who's a MD, he picked up, so BBC is in England, right?
Sure.
So he picked up on, there was a little bit of publicity on our studies with Dr. Harvey, and he picked up on that. And then he came to my lab, also went to Walter Longo's lab at USC and Chris DeVerdi up at University of Chicago. And he tried like Walter Longo's approach of going 3 to 5 days in a row with no food. And then he tried the 5-2, and he took his own blood and so on and so forth. So then that program aired in England, and then PBS bought it, and it aired in the States. And in the meantime, Mosley, Dr. Harvey, and several other actually copycat people who didn't really do the research published books. And then what happened, of course, the internet is here. And if you would have went on Google, even I'd say 5 years ago, 5 to 7 years ago, and you put in intermittent fasting, pretty much all of the first couple pages would be some of the science. Now, if you put intermittent fasting on and Google it, it's hard to find the science. All the first number of pages are just these random people who picked up on it, and many of them are good and well-intentioned, and I think most of them are, I think, just spreading the word. But there are some people who are trying to make money, which I can't understand, right? I mean, intermittent fasting people should save money, don't have to.
Yeah, exactly.
But so that's kind of the history, and then so it took off just because of the BBC program, number of books, and then the internet. There's also another angle on this. And you mentioned that intermittent fasting has been known and discussed for even before I started doing research on it in the 90s. And turns out that bodybuilders, and my understanding of the history of this is that they figured out on their own that if they don't eat breakfast and then do their resistance training noontime and then eat, after that, probably until they go to bed, that because they're doing their lifting in a fasted state, it accentuates the fat loss. They don't want much fat so that you can see the big muscles. And it did not adversely affect their ability to build muscle. And this now has been actually shown in formal studies published recently. We think we know what's going on, and it's not really complicated. In fact, a lot of overlap in the way that fasting and exercise benefit cells. So what happens is that during the exercise and during the fasting, cells go into a kind of conserve resources and stress resistance mode. And their overall protein synthesis and growth is pretty much shut down. So they reduce their uptake of amino acids, and they shift energy resources to conserving what they have and kind of surviving this stressful period. And then during the recovery period, that is eating after fasting, resting and sleeping after exercise, there's a big increase in protein synthesis, and that's when cells grow. Your muscle cells don't get bigger while you're exercising. They grow in size during recovery period.
Recovering. Mm-hmm.
And we think it's also, but for example, in the brain, we have evidence that, this is really interesting, and so that intermittent and this is known from muscle too, actually, intermittent fasting will stimulate an increase in the number of mitochondria in muscle cells, just similar to what exercise does,
really?
although quantitatively not nearly as much as exercise. And we found that intermittent fasting will increase the number of mitochondria in neurons in the brain, and that intermittent fasting will promote the ability of the nerve cells to grow and form new synapses, in addition to increasing their resistance to stress.
And is it an additive effect? So if you're exercising, you're still getting additional benefits on top of that if you're doing the IF? Or is it a replacement? If you're not really exercising much, the IF can help make up for that in these different ways.
Yep. From the standpoint of the brain, the answer is yes, there seem to be additive effects of intermittent fasting and exercise. We did a study where we found that, so we had mice in 4 conditions. The control is they're fed ad libitum, eat, they always have food, sedentary. Then we had running wheels, but ad libitum feeding. Then we had intermittent fasting alone and intermittent fasting plus voluntary running wheel exercise. And we found over a period of a couple months, both the intermittent fasting and the running wheel exercise increased the number of synapses on particular type of neuron that we study that's important in learning and memory. Wow. And then the combination, there was an additive effect. We did the same thing in diabetic mice and found that we were able to stimulate an increase in number of synapses in the diabetic animal. But as far as exercise, which we'll get into talking about soon, there really needs to be some well-designed studies to address it. I mentioned what the bodybuilders do, but as far as other athletes, of which there's many, endurance athletes, people who sprinters, or I think a lot about track and field and running because I used to coach high school cross country. So there's a lot of work needs to be done. I've tried to get the distance coaches at Johns Hopkins to do a study of intermittent fasting where we'd have them. The idea would be to have, during the summer, before cross-country season, get half of the runners adapted to intermittent fasting, the other half they eat normally, and then keep them on those eating patterns during the season. And there's a lot of ways you could look at their performance, but mainly it'd be based on running on the same courses they ran on in previous years and comparing times, or where were they among the runners on the team previous year, and do they move up or back? But it's hard to get everyone to buy into it.
Sure, small window.
Well, and they don't want to take a chance. Well, maybe that's going to make it worse. And
right. Well, and for the individual athlete, I mean, they've got a small window of 1 or 2 years to really be at their best. They're probably thinking, I don't know, Doc.
Yeah, I got some of my. So before I retired from the National Institute on Aging, we have positions that we can fill with either postdoctoral fellows or post-bac fellows that after they get their bachelor's degree, they take a year or two and do research at NIH before they go to graduate or medical school. And so since I knew I was going to retire, and the post-bac fellows, it's only short-term compared to postdocs. So I recruited post-bac fellows who were undergraduate neuroscience majors, had high GPAs, but were also runners. And so I had a couple D1 distance runners and so on. But I got a couple of them to try intermittent fasting, and they're still doing it. And myself, I found when I was trail running that so my routine when I was at NIH was go to the lab early in the morning, not eating breakfast. Then I'd usually eat like 11 or so, and then go on a trail run mid to late afternoon. And sometimes like I forgot to bring my lunch, and so I'd go on a trail run having not eaten anything all day. And this is just my own perception, but I felt like I was actually running better when I hadn't eaten any lunch. And people can maintain their weight on an intermittent fasting eating pattern. It's just a matter of simple calorie intake. But if someone does like I do, daily time restricted eating, restricting my food intake to 6-hour time window, and then kind of not eating like say a couple of huge meals during that time, but eating something every hour over that 6-hour time window, it's easy to get the same calories you were getting before when you're eating 3 meals. So that I think is something that what's a big issue for a lot of people is that they don't realize that it takes several weeks to a month to adapt to the new eating pattern so that they're no longer hungry and irritable during the time period they normally would have eaten. And once they get through that adaptation period, they're no longer hungry or irritable. And it's easy for a lot of, we think from our human studies, for most people to adapt to.
Once you get through that 30 days.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So the benefits for weight loss, obesity, diabetes, related cardiovascular disease, that's completely logical. How about the person who's listening who says, I'm pretty healthy. Weight's not a big deal right now. Maybe they're not an elite athlete, but they've heard about this and they're wondering, I'm already exercising. Are there ways for these folks that they can monitor positive changes outside of having access to lab work?
Well, kind of.
I mean, does it affect sleep that they'll pick up on? Does it affect, I know there's some on mental clarity, but are there any pseudo-objective personal things that Joe sitting over here can start journaling in his running journal or his daily tracker or whatever to say, you know what, I think it is making a difference. Not for weight, but just for life.
Yeah. Oh, well, okay. So one would be resting heart rate.
Okay.
In animals and humans, intermittent fasting alone will reduce resting heart rate significantly. And
and HRV also, right?
It increases HRV.
Right, which is good for the listeners.
Yes, and we're the first to show that in rats where we implanted transmitters where we could continuously monitor blood pressure and heart rate, and then we switched them to an every other day fasting eating pattern. And not immediately, but within 2 to 4 weeks, there was clear, highly significant reductions in resting heart rate and blood pressure. And then we did the spectral analysis, and we did for heart rate variability, the variability and the time interval between individual beats. And then we did pharmacological manipulations with drugs that affect either the parasympathetic or sympathetic nervous systems. If you remember, the parasympathetic system slows down the heart rate, increases heart rate variability. The sympathetic increases heart rate. And bottom line is we found that similar to endurance training, intermittent fasting enhanced parasympathetic tone.
So those are clear. I mean, that's a great pairing, that resting heart rate and HRV. A lot of folks are probably either, we just had Dr. Emma Mosley on a few weeks ago talking about HRV. So a lot of folks are getting insights into this, and those are valuable measurements that most people can do. Okay, I like that. So what about the person who only partially follows this? So they're not doing the 5-2, they're not doing the intermittent, 6 to 8 hour eating period consistently. They do it 5-6 days a week, and then they don't for a couple days. And are there benefits to that, or do you pretty much need to say, I'm either in or I'm out?
I can't say for sure because there haven't been studies that address that, but my educated guess is that they will still benefit, but there's such a profound effect on their circadian timing of eating and adjusting the eating pattern that if they're switching back and forth, it may be harder. And in fact, it's turning out that the 5-2 approach may not be ideal as far as adapting from the standpoint of hunger because you're only doing it 2 days a week,
right?
And then the other 5 days not. Whereas daily time restricted eating, once you get adapted, then everything's in sync. And so I that's all I can say about that.
Okay, fair enough. Well, here's a very specific question. We had a question from one of our listeners about coffee creamer. So my understanding is the intermittent fasting, you can drink water, you can drink black coffee in the outside of the fasting zone. So if you wake up at 7 a.m, you're not going to eat until 11. Black coffee's fine. This person's question was, well, what if I really like that creamer? Does it really matter to have a little dash, or does that my understanding is that triggers the removal of the fasting process, but can you talk that through? Because that's probably a common question.
It is a common question. Any carbohydrates will rapidly cause ketones to go down.
Okay.
So, some people are, if you want to have something besides coffee or straight coffee or tea, water, some people are putting what are called medium chain triglycerides, MCTs, which are small fats that are immediate precursors of the ketones. So,
okay.
So if you and they taste fairly good.
You hesitated there.
Yeah, and so that's one. But kind of the key thing is don't ingest any carbs during the fasting period.
And so then proteins and fats are completely all in.
Proteins
seems like they'd be
the proteins
sensed by the body differently.
Yeah, they are. Proteins, no. Fat, yes.
Okay, so fat is okay, but make sure, folks, when you're reading those labels, it's only the fats. So, okay, very good. Just want to clarify that. All right, it seems like there's a big overlap between the keto approach and the intermittent fasting in terms of where the benefits and where the research is. Can you talk to that a little bit about maybe the differences or how they might relate to each other, things for people to be aware of that one offers that the other doesn't?
One way to think about this is from an evolutionary perspective, and that our human ancestors before the agricultural revolution and animals in the wild, they are in environments where food is relatively scarce, and so they're kind of on intermittent fasting involuntarily. And we're omnivores, and so during evolution, individuals whose brains and bodies functioned really well, perhaps optimally when they were in a food-deprived state, had a survival advantage. That is to say, if they could figure out how to find food and also could expend a lot of energy to get that food, then they pass their genes on. And so there's more than just ketones involved. Ketones play an important role, but there's a lot of activity dependent, both brain neural network activity and neuromuscular activity that drive changes that are beneficial, not only for those organ systems, but we think also for other tissues that are independent of ketones. So again, with exercise, strengthening of the muscles is dependent on activity of the muscles. There's a lot of evidence that strengthening of the brain, if you will, is dependent upon activity in nerve cells in the brains. And in fact, we found that a protein called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is well known to be critical for learning and memory and formation of new synapses, we found that it was stimulated by intermittent fasting and apparently in an neural network activity-dependent manner. So when you haven't been able to find food, your brain cells are more active, and that activity in itself leads to beneficial effects that are independent of the ketones.
Okay. All right. So the keto approach or diet or strategy or whatever will overlap some of those benefits, but then they won't tap in at all to the things that you're talking about there.
Yes.
Okay, very good. All right, let's talk about athletes for a minute. You're an athlete. You're an endurance athlete. You talked about being a coach there in your area. When it comes to athletes, and especially endurance athletes, any research in regards to performance enhancing over time? I think I've read something about reduced inflammation potentially, maybe some improved recovery. Can you walk us through that a little bit, or the potential of that?
Uh, there's in my mind a lot of potential. However, it's not clear whether an intermittent fasting eating pattern is superior to regular eating pattern in endurance athletes yet. We really need studies with really well-defined groups of athletes that are done in a randomized manner. That is, some of the athletes of similar ability are assigned to intermittent fasting eating pattern, the others to regular eating pattern,
Right.
and then they're followed over time. And cross-sectional data are not really, in my mind, too useful. And you really need, the more variability there is in the athletes you're studying, inter-individual variability in their ability, the harder it will be to know if there's an effect because of, if you will, the standard deviation is going to be increased a lot.
We have a lot of masters athletes that listen to this podcast. So for that person who's not a professional, they're not competing at the Olympic level, they care about their performance, but they also care about their work performance and their, life, mental clarity, all those kinds of things. For that person, are there benefits, or the fact that they're already that high level? Let's take the top 5% of masters athletes in terms of performance and ability. Are they going to garner any benefit from this? Or you've said athletically, we don't know yet. Is there enough outside of that to make that a regular part of their pattern? Or do you say, you know what, with everything else they're doing, they're pretty dialed in. I wouldn't put a focus on that.
I think the good news is it's easy, in people who are very health conscious and the group of people you're talking about, it's pretty easy for them to determine, to try it and then determine over a period of at least months or maybe 1 year compared to other years. And they could go to their doctor and just do general blood work is enough to know fasting glucose, triglycerides, cholesterol, and H1C, which is kind of a marker of glucose levels under the curve over time.
So then, an N of 1 makes sense in that case of somebody that cares enough to dive in. Any modifications due to the number of calories they're burning? So the Ironman triathlete or the marathoner, ultra runner, do they need to be extra focused on, okay, I'm only eating in a 6 or 8 hour period instead of a 17-hour period? Any suggestions along those lines for those folks?
It's important that at that level, one can assume that their body mass index is, in the low healthy range. And so they want to maintain their body weight as much as they can. And they also endurance athletes need some fat because that's what they're using. If they're not assuming they're not taking in sugars during the event, which some people do. But so I think they could adjust the time window. 8 hours, 16 hours fasting is plenty to have the metabolic switch occur and ketones go up and being used. So I think they can play with that and see how it goes.
Okay, good. You've done a lot of research on Alzheimer's. So if we could cross two areas a little bit, any additional findings to note that might be important on that front or are developing on that front for somebody who may have a friend or a family member that's in the early stages? Are we seeing any benefits from this strategy?
Well, the trials in humans with Alzheimer's disease are what's called mild cognitive impairment, which at least in some people with clearly detectable problems with short-term memory, they're definitely at increased risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. What we do know is that intermittent fasting can shift some risk factors for Alzheimer's in the right direction. And specifically, type 2 diabetes is a risk factor now. It's pretty well recognized. Maybe long-term obesity or overweight, throughout life. then inflammation is reduced, and inflammation, as in a lot of chronic diseases, cardiovascular disease, there's inflammation of the blood vessels, and actually cancers often involve inflammation. And in Alzheimer's disease, there's local inflammation in the brain. And animal studies show that intermittent fasting can reduce inflammation in the brain. We also know that there's good evidence that regular exercise during adult life reduces risk for Alzheimer's. Sure. And also keeping intellectually engaged and socially engaged. And that gets back to what I was talking about. By activity in nerve cell networks in the brain is good for those nerve cell networks. Exercising your brain cells is good for them, just as exercising your muscles. So those three things: regular exercise, keeping your brain active, and perhaps intermittent fasting eating pattern could make it less likely that you'll develop cognitive impairment when you get old.
So those are in terms of reducing future risks or current risk factors that would affect the future. How about the person who, oh man, mom's seeing this or dad's seeing this or whatever? Do we have any encouraging data saying if you then start, we're already there, we're already starting to see the decline. If we then start a pattern of intermittent fasting, it seems to push it back a little bit. It seems to keep that curve from dropping off as fast.
Such studies remain to be done, but there are studies suggesting that ketones through ketone ester or medium chain triglycerides may be beneficial. And that's based in part on the work of Dr. Steve Cunan up at Vancouver, who used what's called positron emission tomography, PET scanning methods to show that nerve cells in the brains of people with mild cognitive impairment and early Alzheimer's disease, they are not able to use glucose very well, certainly not normally. And however, they're still able to use ketones. So there's some excitement now about the potential for elevating ketones. In theory, intermittent fasting should be beneficial not only for the ketones, but what we talked about before, changes in activity in neuronal circuits in the brain in response to the fasting.
So if it were you, we don't have research on this yet, but if it were you would give it a shot because you see certain indications that potential is more than 50-50, it's going to help.
Yes.
Okay, good. Just a couple more. Any contraindications our listeners need to be aware of? Just as they're talking to folks and people say, hey, I'm going to do this thing. Any contraindications that they need to bring to the forefront in those conversations?
Little children, women who are pregnant and who have not previously been adapted to intermittent fasting, although research still needs to be done there because we don't know for sure that. We know now, for example, in medicine, there's a lot of myths that have been overturned. Starting with, if you have a heart attack, you should not overexert yourself. You should rest. You don't want to stress your heart. Well, we know that's the worst thing you can do. Pregnant women now are encouraged to get some exercise. And as you know, there are some women who are running marathons while they're pregnant. And then little children who are growing rapidly. There is some interest, though, from the standpoint of obesity. Childhood obesity is at a dramatic increase recently. And I've talked to parents who, they were doing intermittent fasting. Their child was way overweight. These are like middle school age kids. And then what they did is they got their kid to shift to the parents' intermittent fasting eating pattern, and then they claim their kid was able to lose weight. So, I would submit that our 3 meals a day plus snacks is an abnormal eating pattern from evolutionary perspective, and that most people can adapt to it. One contraindication would be elderly, frail people who have, and people who already have a very low body mass index.
Last question. Any final words of wisdom for folks that are trying to help others improve their health and wellness, or just trying to improve their own either health and wellness or their performance when it comes to intermittent fasting, obviously?
Well, the first is what I mentioned, is that it takes up to a month to adapt to an intermittent fasting eating pattern. And vast majority of people will adapt so that it's no problem. That's their new lifestyle eating pattern. So that's people may want to do it with friends or spouse or
good thought.
So on. So it's always nice to, when you're doing something like that, whether it's an exercise program or something like changing your eating pattern, to have someone to talk to and kind of cheerlead each other, encourage each other. From the workplace standpoint, it's interesting. There are a number of companies in Silicon Valley, the big companies, that many of their employees are switched to intermittent fasting eating pattern as kind of a group thing. They're doing it mainly because they think, and I think they're probably right, it can enhance their cognition and creativity and productivity. In that case, they don't have to be more creative about finding food in a food sparse environment, but they can be, maybe translates to more creativity and whatever the software they're developing.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's got to be attractive to everybody.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very good. Well, thank you so much. You're so busy. You got so much going on. You're one of the foremost experts in this, and I just really appreciate you taking the time. So thanks for diving in with us. And what's the best way for folks to keep track of you? Is there a website you'd like them to go to, or are you on Twitter? What's the best way if people want to tap into more of this?
No, I'm not on Twitter. People want to know some of my scientific publications, and I've written a number of review articles that at least are partially understandable by most people. They're welcome to shoot me an email. If they go on Google, and my Hopkins web page now has my contact information.
Okay, perfect.
I prefer email rather than phone, though.
Okay, very good. Well, we will mention that in the intro. And again, really appreciate the time.
Okay, Brad. Have a good rest of the day.
You too. Take care.
Yep. Bye.
What an honor to have Dr. Mattson join us for this hidden gem. It's one of our most downloaded episodes of all time, and now you can see why. By the way, for the coaches out there, just a reminder, it's not our job, it's not our role to tell people what to do or recommend an eating plan. But it is important for us to be aware of the evidence and the research that our clients may find helpful as they consider what's best for their lives. You clearly won't find anyone better than Dr. Mark Mattson in terms of the evidence-based insights on the topic of intermittent fasting. As a side note, he mentions at the end of his interview he's happy to receive emails from people who may have questions about his research. His email is mmattso and then the number 2 at jhmi.edu, and we'll have a link to that in the description. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoy podcasts, please share it with others. You may also enjoy our complimentary video resources available over at youtube.com/coaching channel. Now let's go be a catalyst. One step, one decision, one day at a time. Today is our opportunity. Let's make the most of it. This is Dr. Bradford Cooper signing off. Make it a great rest of your week, and I'll speak with you soon on the next episode of the Catalyst Health, Wellness, and Performance Coaching Podcast, or maybe over on the YouTube coaching channel.